The engagement ceremony of Psyche Callista and Prince Aros Vasilios unfolded inside a breathtaking palace, dripping with gold and grandeur, and no matter how furious or helpless Media Solon felt in that moment, she could do absolutely nothing about it. All she could do was stand in a corner and listen to every heartfelt blessing pouring in for the happy couple, with a smile frozen on her face. Days later, rumors began spreading through town that the newly engaged pair had escaped to a resort in the south, and the people could not stop talking about their love story. A chubby man whispered to his friend that Lady Psyche had lost the crown princess contest, and His Highness must be remarkably partial to her, considering how fiercely he defended the Callista family when they were falsely accused of attempting to take a member of the imperial family's life. But then Media herself appeared on the scene, and fortunately, a sharp-eyed servant pulled her aside, warning her not to act on the rage burning behind her eyes, or she would pay dearly for words she couldn't take back. Still, before leaving, Media turned and left a single cold warning behind, saying, "I'll remember you." When she returned home, she was met with devastating news from the family doctor, and her mother's condition had worsened so dramatically she might not survive the year. Her father was livid, and even Media herself couldn't escape the resentment twisting in her chest, convinced that every bit of this suffering traced back to Psyche. When word reached them that Psyche and Aros were vacationing together in the south, a loyal servant stepped forward with a bold proposal, suggesting that she have them quietly eliminated. However, after long and careful contemplation, Dari Mia chose not to follow her advisor's extreme suggestion. At the same time, Psyche wandered into a nearby jewelry store looking for the perfect gift for Media, and though what she chose remained a mystery, the shopkeeper let slip it was one of the most sought-after items tourists ever came in for. The moment Eros laid eyes on the purchased item, he was not only deeply pleased, but burning with curiosity about how exactly Media would react the instant it arrived at her door, and they wasted no time sending a messenger with the gift the very day they returned from vacation. The gift bearer insisted on orders to personally witness the unboxing, leaving Media with no way to decline, and as she peeled back the lid, her expression turned to stone. The moment the messenger left, she erupted and sent the box flying across the room with such force that her hand split open on the corner of it. Everyone watching understood at once what Psyche had done, as the contents rolled out onto the floor, revealing a precious gemstone ring, because sending a ring like that was nothing less than open mockery. If Psyche wanted to play games, then Media would play until there was nothing left to play with. Her rival had now returned safely to the Count's manor, and upon Psyche's arrival, she found a return gift waiting from Media herself, wrapped beautifully in the form of a bouquet of deep red flowers. According to the letter Media enclosed, the fragrance of these flowers possessed a rare ability to aid peaceful sleep, and she warmly advised Psyche to keep them close by her bedside at night. Psyche read through the final lines of the letter, and a radiant smile broke across her face, because she never once imagined that Media would want to sit down for tea with her to clear the air between them. Although every servant in Psyche's household sounded the alarm and urged her to refuse, she paid them no mind because she had already arranged to visit the temple the following day and scheduled the tea for the day after that. Media arrived personally for the tea, carrying her own leaves and sugar, and brewed it herself right there in front of Psyche. But then a young knight nearby overheard the maids whispering unfavorable things and came to investigate. And Media knew this knight well because he had been adopted by a knight family from the very day of his birth. When Media stepped away briefly, something happened to Psyche that no one could explain, and she was suddenly gripped by a savage fever that came on without warning. The knight made a startling choice, and rather than calling for a physician, he pulled on his cloak and rode hard into the forest. And as he galloped through the trees, his mind kept circling back to that bouquet and the sugar cubes that Media had personally prepared. Suddenly, his horse thrashed and reared and threw him off, and when he landed and looked up, he found himself staring directly at Media herself. After dealing with the young knight in her own way, Media revealed the full truth of it. And the flower's fragrance was entirely harmless on its own, but when it combined with the drug she had dissolved into the sugar cubes, it became a slow and potent poison. Out of nowhere, a young man materialized and helped her wipe away every trace of evidence, and a curious Helio wanted to know whether Psyche had actually perished, but to his complete surprise, Media told him she would recover in time. And indeed, as she said those words, Psyche was still very much alive. sitting at her family table, trying to eat a meal, but looking so pale and drained she could hardly lift her fork. When Psyche arrived at the temple, her household staff began murmuring anxiously about the young knight who had vanished, and two of them decided to go into the forest to search for him, and when they pushed through the trees, they came upon Helio, wearing the missing knight's armor. Meanwhile, inside the temple, Psyche was deep in a prayer ceremony surrounded by watching eyes, and at that very same time, Medea slipped quietly into the temple through a hidden passage to find a monk who had been waiting for her. He told her that on the day of the prayer ceremony, the temple would be completely empty and only Psyche would be permitted inside alone, after which he pressed a key into her hand and showed her the entrance to a secret tunnel hidden in the wall. Back in the forest, Helio had subdued the servant, and it was only in the servant's final moments that he realized, with cold clarity, that the man accompanying him all along had actually been one of Medea's planted spies. That's when Medea stepped through into the temple, and when she appeared before Psyche, the girl didn't even flinch, and she regained her composure within seconds before asking, with quiet steel in her voice, "What have you done with my knight?" Medea let out a soft laugh and started to answer, but before the words left her mouth, Psyche lunged at her and drove her back with startling force. After pushing Medea away, Psyche pressed her relentlessly, asking if she still carried a grudge because Psyche had taken his highness away from her. As Psyche spoke the words out loud, Medea's expression shifted because Psyche had just exposed the truth, that Medea didn't love Eros as a person at all, and what she had always loved was his power and the throne that came with it. As Medea pushed back and tried to rise, she lost her footing and plunged backward into the deep and sacred pond below. In that most desperate, suffocating moment, Medea saw a faint shimmer of light ripple beneath the water, and she wondered with a pounding heart whether it was some kind of divine force, and in that darkness she whispered a quiet prayer, saying, "If you truly are the guardian deity of Vasilios, give me the chance to rule instead of this foolish girl." And she wanted to take absolutely everything from Psyche. The moment Medea regained consciousness and forced her eyes open, she was surrounded by a chorus of relieved and joyful cries from servants. And when she asked in confusion where she was, the eldest servant burst into tears and said, "Please don't frighten us like that. My poor heart cannot survive another scare." Then she glanced around and caught herself in the mirror, and what happened next shocked everyone because she rushed to it and stood frozen, staring at a face that was not her own, and she genuinely had not expected to truly become Psyche in body and flesh. While Medea was still reeling from shock, unsure whether this was a dream or some waking nightmare, Aros burst through the door, ignoring every servant's protest, and rushed straight to her side. And the moment he saw her awake, he seized her hand and would not let go. He said he was relieved to see she was okay, and that he had been tormented every second, fearing he might lose her, and that he had been so frightened. And those tender words and the warmth of his grip flooded Medea with a joy so powerful it was almost unbearable. She immediately threw her arms around Eros and held on tightly, while he made vow after vow to severely punish whoever had dared harm her and disturb the sacred prayer ceremony. At the same time, on the other side of the city, Psyche stood before a mirror in Medea's body, just as bewildered and lost as Medea had been, and she gave her own cheek a slow, tentative slap to test whether any of this was real, and it stung with full and sharp certainty. As Psyche turned the situation over in her mind, panic came crashing down on her, and she bolted downstairs, determined to leave the house immediately. But the worried servants threw themselves in her path, begging her to stop, and she insisted, in a shaking voice, that they not call her Lady Medea, and that she needed to return to her own home. Outside, the rain fell without mercy, and lightning split the sky in half, but inside the Count's manor, the atmosphere was oddly warm and celebratory and festive, as if nothing at all had gone wrong. Perhaps because of the overwhelming rush of excitement coursing through her, Medea very nearly suggested to Eros that they should simply be done with Psyche altogether, but she caught herself just in time and offered a much more gracious alternative instead. Upon hearing how lenient her words were, Eros sighed and said quietly that he knew she would say that. And just then, the commotion outside pulled a servant away to investigate, and they came back to report that someone was causing a disturbance at the gate. Aros went out himself, and the instant his eyes fell on Psyche, standing there in the rain, his face darkened with fury, and he grabbed her by the collar and snarled that she should be grateful he wasn't taking her head right there on the spot. Media watched from a safe distance and allowed herself a private moment of amusement, because it was honestly rather funny that the man who claimed he would sacrifice his own life for Psyche could not recognize her standing 2 feet in front of him wearing someone else's face. He barred Psyche from setting foot in the mansion, and that was the end of it. The following morning, while Media was quietly studying the body she now occupied, a maid entered unexpectedly, and she looked as though she had been carrying a terrible weight for a very long time. And she came forward and confessed everything. She had been spying for the Solon family out of desperate need to fund her siblings' medical care. And she also revealed that the incident with the knight and the attack on Psyche's servant was never caused by a wild animal at all, but had been orchestrated entirely by Media. Media immediately opened her arms and held the maid close, saying softly that she was so sorry and that she had no idea how hard things had been. And the maid broke down into heavy tears, completely unaware that the woman embracing her was silently weighing whether or not to have her tongue removed and fed to the dogs. Beneath the full and luminous moon that night, Media made herself a silent vow, and if she woke up in her own body the next morning, she would move against Psyche immediately, but if she did not, she would let the girl live. But the real surprise was yet to come, because when sunlight streamed through the window the following day and illuminated her face, it was still Psyche's face looking back at her in the glass, and the souls had not returned to where they belonged. At that same moment, Psyche, trapped in Media's body, was overwhelmed with dread because the next prayer day was a full year away, and she had no certainty she could reclaim her own form before then. She was so deep in these frightened thoughts that she completely missed a raven perched silently at her window, and she agonized over what she would do if Media's enemies came for her while she was stuck in a body far weaker than her own. Not long after, a maid brought food over, and when Psyche reached out gently to take it, the maid flinched backwards, expecting to be struck, and was so moved to receive a sincere thank you instead that tears began rolling down her face. The raven found its way back to its owner, and Helio discovered a letter still fastened to its leg, which left him deeply unsettled, because in 7 years of close correspondence, they had never gone this long without contact. Filled with worry, he rushed to Media's house without delay. That same day, Media, who was now living as Psyche, received an exquisite golden necklace sent by Eros as a gift, and he wanted her to wear it on his birthday. And after the birthday, he intended for there to be a wedding. Media invented a reason to visit the market and acquired a raven of her own, and while she sat waiting for Eros to arrive for an important discussion, she picked up a book from the desk to pass the time. When Eros returned and found her absorbed in a dense political text, he laughed and offered lightheartedly to buy her a fairy tale book instead, and Media went completely quiet, suddenly wearing the expression of someone who felt slightly underestimated. Eros noticed right away that she had gone still, and he leaned in closer, and when he saw tears gathering in her eyes, he looked genuinely startled and guided her quietly away to another corner of the room. There, in the soft glow of the late afternoon sun, Media told him with a trembling voice that her memories seemed to have disappeared entirely and that she had hoped reading books might help her recover them. Eros reached over and took her hand without hesitation and asked whether she had been disappointed that he had never seemed to notice. And Media answered that the only thing that made her sad was not being able to remember the time they had spent together. And in the very next moment, Eros folded her into his arms and held her, and Media spoke again, saying, "Please, tell me about our precious memories." When birds began calling, with the rising sun and warm light pushed through the curtains, Psyche was sitting over a cup of tea, turning over a nightmare she had just dreamed, in which Eros intended to eliminate her. A servant girl arrived carrying a plate of pastries with her usual cheerful smile, and although the servants had all been baffled at first by their mistress's sudden shift in personality and manner, they had slowly come to accept it. Psyche was still lost in worried thought when she heard a young man's voice announcing that the Marquis was on his way, and a moment later, Helio Neko walked through the door. This young Marquis had been head of the Neko family since the age of 12, when he lost both parents to a carriage accident, and the greedy nobles of the court immediately turned their backs on him, sending his family into ruin. But that was the moment he met Media, and with her backing, Helio had rebuilt everything his family had lost and brought the Neko name back to its former strength. Now, Psyche was terrified of being unmasked, and in the past she had always kept her distance from Helio because his presence alone was so intimidating. But to her relief, he greeted her with warm familiarity. She buried her emotions carefully and showed nothing on her face. Helio took in the surroundings and found the atmosphere strangely peaceful, and then Media's father struck up a conversation with him, and Psyche exhaled slowly because she had been so shaken by Helio's piercing gaze. She was certain for a moment that he had already figured everything out, but then Media's father suggested that Helio spar with Psyche, because lately his daughter had seemed low in spirit, and both Psyche and Helio froze completely for a long and loaded few seconds. Just as Psyche was about to make some excuse, Helio reached over and touched her hair, and noted mildly that he had never seen her braid it that way before, and the observation sent a cold flash of fear through her as she unconsciously brought her hand up to her own neck. When they finally stood across from each other at the training grounds, the servants and Helio were in high spirits, but Psyche stood there with dread pooling in her stomach, wondering if she could even lift the sword properly. And when she wrapped her fingers around the hilt, she was surprised to find it lighter than she expected and realized it must be because she was using Media's physical strength. But then, Helio crossed the distance between them in an instant after watching how she gripped it and asked, with unmistakable suspicion in his voice, "It's strange, no matter how much I think about it, who are you?" He had been the one Media taught to handle a sword, so he knew beyond any doubt that she would never make such a basic error in her grip. Psyche's hand began shaking immediately, and for a breath, she stood there, wondering whether she had been caught. And then she gathered every last bit of her courage and turned the tables by scolding Helio for daring to address her as you instead of her proper title. While Helio stood in stunned silence, she swept her sword up and pressed it dangerously close to his neck and said with cold conviction, "After everything I have done for you." The sharpness of those words silenced him completely, but even so, and even as the blade grazed him, Helio stepped closer toward her without retreating, because in his heart he had begun to suspect that this bold display was only a performance meant to throw him off. But if the girl standing before him was not Media, then he needed to know the truth. Before he could get those words out, Psyche cast her sword aside entirely and said firmly, "Enough. That is enough." With the servants looking on, Helio tended quietly to his wound, and then, as he prepared to leave, he not only apologized to Psyche for the disruption, but made one additional request, which was that he wished to escort her to the imperial banquet at the royal palace the following week. Psyche studied the complex and unreadable look in Helio's eyes for a long, quiet moment before agreeing, and she even reached up and touched his face, lightly, and smiled, saying, "If not you, then who else?" After Helio's carriage had rolled out of sight, she stood looking down at her trembling hand in disbelief, because she had just touched the face of the Marquis of Neko without thinking. When Helio arrived home in the pouring rain, his butler appeared promptly with an umbrella and asked casually whether the visit to the Solon estate had gone smoothly. And as Helio stepped down from the carriage, he told the butler about the strange moment when Psyche had called him Helio rather than Healy, which was the only name Media ever used with him. And even now, Helio could not quite let go of his suspicion. Meanwhile, Media was living her days in Psyche's residence, and she sat before a mirror while a maid worked through her hair with a brush, and the maid cheerfully reminded her that Aros's birthday was only a week away, and began spinning out one romantic scenario after another, predicting that nobles from every corner of the empire would come, and that all eyes would be on Media and the prince. The moment the maid left and the room was quiet and closed, the smile on Media's face dissolved instantly because she was utterly exhausted from holding this mask up in front of every single person around her. But after thinking it through, she knew she could not simply dispose of all of them. She turned her attention to the items she had prepared, and first, she dipped her pen in lemon juice to write a letter in invisible ink, the kind whose words only appear when held near a flame. And this letter was meant for Helio, and it contained the full truth about what had happened between the two of them and the soul exchange. After finishing the letter, she sent a crow out into the sky to carry it to him. But what Media could not have foreseen was that the one who received the letter would be Eros himself, because the man who brought it confirmed the crow had flown directly from Psyche's room. After reading it, Eros appeared to understand everything, and Berthathadior, Sadinater, Di, Unwarza, Sasun, Wherever, Sasun, Yor and Uwazrior resolved to visit the Marquess's manor the very next morning. However, what Aros received turned out to be a masterful forgery, because the real letter had already been spirited away by a mysterious black cat. And when Helio picked up the cat, he noticed a tiny rolled piece of paper fastened to its tail and assumed at once that it was from Media. On the day of the banquet, Media dressed more magnificently than she ever had, and she was painstakingly precise about every detail of her appearance. And when Eros strolled in unannounced, he looked her over and said evenly, "Psyche, I believe you have something to tell me." Media lit up with a brilliant smile and told him she was thrilled to see him because she had just been dreaming of him. But Aros remained completely unmoved by the performance. Unruffled, She kept chattering about tender and romantic things until Aros suddenly rose from where he sat, leaned in close, and said with quiet authority, "Stay away from Media Solon." He also brought up a line from the letter he'd received the previous night, saying, "I'm currently in Count Callista's manor," and he asked her whether she understood what those words meant. Media's voice cracked slightly as she asked, "How did you—" And the truth was, she had long since understood that he kept people watching her around the clock. She summoned her nerve and explained everything, but every single word of her explanation was a fabrication woven with careful precision, and Aros would never know that. After she finished speaking, he said a few consoling words and kissed her on the forehead, and then ordered a servant to bring the dress and the bracelet she would be wearing to the upcoming celebration, and he personally fastened the golden bracelet around her wrist, telling her it would guard her from any harm. That's when things took a dramatic turn, because the moment he finished clasping it, the bracelet sealed itself shut and turned into restraints, locking tightly around her wrists. Before she could form a single word, Aros had her taken down to the basement and had the audacity to tell her, with a perfectly straight face, that he was doing it out of love for her. Media sat there, staring at the wall, and could not find a single word in her vocabulary adequate for this despicable man who had locked her in chains and called it protection. She hadn't imagined for even a moment that the story she had offered him about wanting to mend things with Psyche would be enough to turn her into a prisoner. When Media went to find her wet nurse, hoping for some comfort, the nurse turned on her and scolded her sharply, asking why she had been so disappointing lately, and Media could only laugh in pure, exhausted disbelief. Shortly afterward, Eros himself began quietly wondering whether he had gone too far. And yet, in his mind, Media was unlike anyone else in the world, and she was the most cunning person he had ever encountered. So how could he possibly drop his guard? Meanwhile, every past meeting between Helio and the person he believed to be Media had carried hidden layers of meaning that the real Media would have recognized immediately. But the young woman now standing before him couldn't read a single one of those signals. The moment she saw him appear, Psyche's composure crumbled and her whole body trembled, but she grew even more frightened when she heard Helio say her true name out loud. Then, unexpectedly, he stepped closer and gently lifted the edge of her cloak and warned her in a low voice that anyone else who entered could be a real danger to her, because it turned out he had come to help Psyche learn to carry herself as a true Media. So, her identity would not be exposed at the upcoming Imperial banquet. Psyche looked at him with deep skepticism and asked right away why he would want to help her, and the answer left her completely stunned, because it was none other than Media herself who had instructed him to protect her. The all-powerful force behind the Vasilios Empire was divine power, and only two families in the known world were privileged to carry it and bear the Vasilios name. And the first was the Imperial family, whose purpose was to expand the Empire's reach. And the second was the Pope and the Church, whose calling was to preserve its stability. And together, these two bloodlines shaped every corner of the Empire. In this land, 2 springs and 2 winters marked the calendar, and the formal debut of a young lady into high society signaled the arrival of the first spring. 3 years ago, at a lavish and glittering gathering, the Count Callista's daughter was to be introduced to society for the very first time, and many guests were caught off guard because common belief held that she would remain hidden forever due to the fragile health that had plagued her since birth. At that time, Psyche had been crushed beneath the weight of every cruel whisper in the room, even on her very first step into the world. Meanwhile, Media had already climbed to the heights of influence and commanded the room effortlessly at just 19 years old. And she had been the undisputed star of the gathering right up until the moment Psyche walked in. And every single head turned, and even Media herself was caught off guard by Psyche's appearance. Back in the present, the moon hung round and impossibly bright as Helio drilled Psyche through the night on everything that made Media who she was, and he pressed the importance of straight posture and proper form. And the hardest obstacle of all was the dense phonetic transcription book Psyche could not seem to make sense of, no matter how hard she tried, and she genuinely could not fathom how Media had devoured an entire shelf of these books by the age of 8. Watching Psyche's overly warm and open manner of speaking, Helio quickly pointed out that Media kept people at a cool and measured distance at all times, and he grew more worried by the moment as he realized Psyche had no artistic skill, had no grasp of politics, and had never once picked up a history book in her life. However, at the very least, she could protect herself when she had to. Down in the concealed underground chamber, Media sat quietly in the dark, turning over in her mind whether Eros had any intention of letting her out. And at that same moment, a report reached Eros that there were no suspicious movements coming from the Solon side of things, and he pressed one finger against the cool surface of the window and said with a strange calm, "I believe two are better than one." A few days later, Helio arrived at the residence to escort Psyche to the royal palace, and when he saw the blazing red gown she had selected, his expression dropped, and Psyche asked with genuine innocence if something was wrong, and he didn't speak to its beauty or lack of it, but simply stated that the dress was dangerously conspicuous and could compromise her safety. He stripped the flowers from her hair and her clothing, and while he worked on her appearance, Psyche told him about her history with Eros, including how he had promised to celebrate this birthday with her, and based on what she said, the underground chamber where Media was currently confined had actually once been Psyche's own dwelling, and she had only been freed from it when she turned 19. When Media first set foot in the basement, she had braced for a cold and miserable cell, so she was genuinely surprised to find nothing more than a simple, quiet room, and curiosity immediately nipped at her, as she wondered how Eros had come to know about this hidden chamber in the first place. At the moment in the birthday celebration, when Media came face to face with Psyche, she burned with eagerness to understand what was running through Thasumbi, girl's mind, and whether Psyche, like her, was seething with indignation at the sight of someone else wearing her face beside the prince. As the great hall rang with wave after wave of applause and admiration for Eros and Media, Psyche, standing on the outside, could not silence the nagging question prickling at the back of her mind, and she could not understand why no one could see that it was actually Media standing next to the prince and not her. Just as her agitation was beginning to peak, Helio appeared at her side, reminding her that every compliment and every flattering word in this room was crafted to provoke her, and he told her plainly to stay seated and simply watch, rather than react. Then Eros turned and took Media's hand in his and said, "Psyche, may I have the honor of this first dance?" And before Media could find her footing, the music had already begun, and she was swept out onto the floor. Eros watched her through the first few steps with visible tension, waiting for her to stumble on his feet, and when she never did, he was genuinely surprised and asked if she had improved, and Media replied evenly, "Haven't I improved, Your Highness?" And Eros laughed and handed her several compliments before mentioning that he was trying to decide what gift would be right for her. The more Eros spoke, the more Media was drawn in by the smoothness of it, but the more he went on, the more hollow it began to feel, and she could not shake the thought that this man couldn't even recognize the woman he claimed to truly love standing directly in front of him. Before long, a soldier slipped in and whispered in Eros's ear and informed him that the guests he had asked to meet privately had arrived, and after a brief exchange with Media, he excused himself and slipped away. At the same time, Psyche, who had been searching for Helio, stumbled instead into a young lady from the house of Saria, who began sharing her concerns about the unfavorable rumors she had heard swirling around Media. And as she finished speaking, another girl stepped in to add that there were whispers going around claiming Media had gone completely mad after losing his highness. When Psyche turned her head, she recognized who this girl was, because Helio had warned her in advance to stay away from this particular individual, who had once tried to win Media's favor, and when Media showed no interest, had shifted all her resentment towards Psyche instead. Meanwhile, on a quiet balcony, Media stood with an unsettling feeling spreading through her, because even though everything seemed to be falling perfectly into place, she could not shake the sensation that she had somehow walked into a trap. And she kept turning over the question of why Eros had chosen Psyche as his future wife, when the House of Callista carried such deep and complicated ties to the temple and the imperial family had been feuding for years. As she stood there thinking, she caught the motion of falling leaves, and Helio appeared beside her. At the same moment, on the other side of the gathering, Psyche found herself suddenly confronting people who had come looking for trouble, and when she heard what Saria's daughter was saying, she answered with composed and quiet dignity that left everyone around her struck silent. At first, a spark of pride lit up inside Psyche, but when she actually thought about what it would mean to live as Media for the rest of her life, that spark died out, and she bolted to find a corner with no one in it and dissolved into tears. Because in that moment, she wanted nothing in the world more desperately than to return to her own body. But the real surprise was yet to come, because at that exact time, in a sealed room elsewhere in the palace, Eros sat with 5 unidentified men who were, according to him, the most elite knights the imperial family possessed, an invisible and covert squad that answered only to him. Tonight, Aros had summoned all 5 of them to deal with someone attending this very party, and because the woman in question was rather fragile, he acknowledged that only one was truly needed. But he had brought every single one of them along for what he called safety. Little did Aros expect that the person he intended to eliminate was his own cherished and beloved fiancée. On the other side of the evening, Media and Helio were deep in conversation, and Helio could barely contain his relief when he learned that as long as the crown prince never actually married her, she would return to her original body on the next prayer day. Media chose not to burden Helio with what she had uncovered in the basement, and instead simply asked him to get close to Psyche and pull whatever information he could from her about the crown prince, because she was certain Aros was concealing something significant. Then, they both heard the echo of approaching footsteps, and before Helio stepped away, he pressed something into Media's hand, and though what it was stayed a mystery, when she opened it, she was genuinely moved and felt that of all the people in the world, Helio was the one who truly understood her. No sooner had she tucked the gift away than another person appeared with word that Aros also had a gift waiting for her in the garden. Helio watched her leave and turned back to the banquet where he ran into Lady Saria, who had been searching for him, hoping he might smooth things over with Psyche after a disagreement. And once he had located Psyche, he stepped past Saria and went to her. In the garden, Media walked deeper into the darkness, accompanied by 5 knights, and the further they moved from the lights of the palace, the more wrong everything began to feel, and she asked, "Aren't we too far from the palace?" And the response that came back was nothing but a low grunt. What Media didn't know was that the moment the other girl had answered her, she had already quietly given the signal, and without a sound, a blade was drawn, and the first strike cut through the air. Media evaded it, and whether she had truly dodged or simply stumbled was impossible for the attacker to say, but the outcome was the same, and she was on the ground, alive. The attacker grabbed her collar and warned her to stay still if she wanted to suffer as little as possible, and just as he raised the blade, Helio was across the garden, finding Psyche with her head down and her shoulders shaking, and he sat down beside her and told her quietly, "I won't stand idly by and let you ruin it." Then Psyche looked up at him through her tears and asked in a small voice whether he had fallen in love with Media, and before she could push for a real answer, snow began drifting down silently from the sky above them. Deep in the garden, at that same moment, something shifted in Media, and she suddenly felt the ground of a thought she hadn't considered before, and she wondered whether she had been wrong all along, and perhaps she hadn't become Psyche because the deity had granted her wish, but instead, perhaps they had switched so that Media could be here for precisely this moment. The attacker, who should have been moving, was still, and his teammates urged him to hurry, and he struggled up onto his feet and turned, but made it exactly 1 step before his knees buckled under him, and he crumpled forward, because Helio, before departing, had slipped Media a small hidden sword. When the girl commanding them warned the others to be careful, Media raised her sword and stepped forward and demanded to know, with cold precision, who had sent them, and whether it was someone inside the Empire or the Crown Prince himself. When it became clear that the girl would not give up a name, Media moved to act, but a man stepped in from the side and stripped the sword from her hand and pulled the girl out of reach. These were not ordinary soldiers, and Media could see that clearly as she assessed them, because they were knights, and good ones. And if she were in her own body, she was certain she could have handled them without difficulty, but this was Psyche's body, and the arms were too weak, and a direct trade of strikes would end badly for her. While this was unfolding, Aros was laughing and raising glasses with guests and celebrating happily, and he had noticed Media's absence from the main hall, and was quietly satisfied that things appeared to be going exactly as he had planned. Meanwhile, Helio and Psyche were making their way back through the palace, and Helio was the only one talking. And then, out of nowhere, he asked Psyche whether she had ever been jealous of Media, and after a hesitation, Psyche admitted yes, and said it was because Media was so impossibly strong. And neither of them had any idea at that moment that Media was in the dark garden, completely outnumbered by 4 Imperial Knights closing in on her. As the opponents pressed forward, Media knew that fighting them strength against strength in this body was not an option, and when one of the men drove a strike at her, she threw herself sideways out of the way and grabbed a fistful of earth and sand and flung it directly at his eyes. He blocked it in time with his cloak and then berated her for what he called cowardice. And Media looked at him and said the word cowardly back to him, asking who exactly was calling whom a coward when 4 men had ganged up on a single woman in the dark, and that was undoubtedly an act of cowardice. She noticed he had no emblems on his armor and understood with a sinking clarity that these were not an official sanctioned order, but knights pulled and trained privately by the imperial household. And in this empire, the only person theoretically capable of standing against them was Helio. Media knew that no matter how harshly she dealt with them, they would never betray the one who sent them. But she could not afford to let the standoff drag on much longer, because the longer it went, the more Psyche's body betrayed her. She grabbed the third man's cloak and drove a blow into his sword hand, and when he went down, the remaining two had already lost the fire in their eyes. That's when things took a dramatic turn, and in the middle of the standoff, Media felt a sharp and sudden frustration rise in her, and she asked herself why she was fighting here in Psyche's place. And she wondered whether the guardian deity of this empire had orchestrated this entire exchange just to use her as a stand-in. But perhaps the deity had not accounted for one thing, because from the time she was a small child, Media had always burned with the desire to carve her own path and change her own fate. When Media was just 8 years old, one evening her beloved Nana handed her a soft little teddy bear and told her, with a warm smile, that it was a birthday gift from her mother. After Media had gone to bed, Nana slipped out of the room and ran directly into another maid in the hallway. And the maid looked at Nana's face and said immediately that impersonating the mistress was a serious offense, and that if the head of the house found out, she could lose her position. The maid had watched Nana sneak out to the market earlier that afternoon to buy the bear with her own money. Nana was not the least bit afraid of the maid's warning, and the maid couldn't understand why Nana would go through all that effort to buy a cheap toy and hand it over pretending it was from someone else. But Nana said simply, what a child of her age needs most is a simple, I love you. Perhaps they had spoken too loudly because Media heard every word from her room, but she didn't feel sad when she found out the bear wasn't really from her mother, and the only thing weighing on her was Nana, and how much effort Nana must have had to give just to bring home that one small thing. The following day, Media witnessed a heated argument in the house where the woman was furious and insisted that Media was far too young to be filling her head with such ambitious ideas. And then her mother turned and took Media's hand and said, don't get ahead of yourself. Anyone can seem smart when they're young. But in the next breath, her mother also said that, as her daughter, she had to be a genius that appeared only once in a millennium. And not only that, but she wanted Media's name to appear in the history books. Fueled by those words, Media practically lived in the library from that day on, and no matter how many times her nose bled, and no matter how many times Nana begged her to rest, she did not stop. 2 years passed, and with the coming of spring, a new opportunity appeared. And though it was meant to be a routine business trip with her father, Media treated it like an adventure. And while she was pressing her face to the carriage window and drinking in the scenery, her father was quietly wrestling with a serious problem because the sun had been sparse that year and the food supply might not make it through the cold months ahead. Without hesitation, Media reached over and grabbed her father's sleeve and asked why they didn't simply open trade with the neighboring territory. And after her father and the woman sat with the idea and turned it over, they praised her without reservation. In the years that followed, her country stepped back from the edge of famine, and her father was honored by the king. And from that moment on, he began bringing Media into conversations about affairs of state, and she became a genuine voice in the room. A few years later, Media had grown into a striking young woman, and the maids loved to praise her father's exceptional devotion, comparing her to a gem he kept behind glass. And when the conversation turned to the acclaim surrounding her father's brilliant strategies, Media began to examine things from a new angle. Because if things continued exactly as they were, and every achievement was credited to him, then how would her name ever find its way into the pages of history? One day, her father announced that she would be engaged that very year, and she smiled warmly and thanked him. And when she was back in her room, Nana rushed up and took both her hands and begged her not to live like a doll that only does what it's told. Media stood still for a few seconds and then pulled Nana close and said, "You are the only one who genuinely cares about me." But even as she continued to assist her father through one difficult issue after another, she'd already laid out a very different road for herself in the quiet of her own mind, and she'd already chosen to walk it. Among the young ladies of the court, there was constant animated discussion about the Solon family's reach, and they firmly believed that if Media became crown princess, the empire would rise to new heights. And the first time Psyche ever laid eyes on Media, she was so captivated she could barely contain herself. And from that day forward, she began following Media quietly from a distance wherever she went. And no matter what Media did or where she was, Psyche watched. At that very moment, Media was speaking with Helio and venting her frustration about Psyche's constant shadowing. And after thinking for a moment, Helio suggested that since Media was on the verge of becoming crown princess, everyone would naturally move toward her for favor, including Psyche. And Media told him that once people started hearing the rumors about her, this kind of thing would stop on its own. Little did she know that when Psyche overheard people call Media a madwoman and a true demon, she felt neither fear nor the desire to pull away, and instead, she wanted every single person who had spoken ill of Media to come back and apologize. And this audacity of Psyche's infuriated one wretched man so deeply that he struck her across the face. As he raised his hand to do it again, Media appeared out of nowhere and seized his arm, and after delivering a sharp reprimand, she forced his head against a nearby statue so hard the other man standing by turned and ran. In that moment, Psyche couldn't help herself and called out, "Lady Media!" And then Media caught her arm as well, perhaps harder than she intended, because Psyche winced visibly in pain, and Media looked at the fragile girl before her and told her bluntly that behaving so boldly would only bring her more trouble. And Psyche's eyes filled with tears, which Media found completely baffling. The next day, when Nana learned that Media was going to meet Psyche, she was overjoyed, and Media mentioned that Psyche had not left her alone until she agreed, and Nana noticed, with a smile, that the two young women were really quite alike. When Media met Psyche that day, Psyche mentioned that people were already comparing them to a queen and a pawn on a chessboard, and Media was caught off guard and asked if she knew how to play chess. And Psyche laughed and said, "No, I only knew that the pawn was the most common piece on the board." Media decided she would teach her, and after listening to Media walk her through the game, Psyche couldn't hold back her tears, and Media stepped forward quickly and held her. Then one day, bad news arrived that sent everything sideways because the engagement had been canceled, and according to Media's father, Aros had suddenly chosen to break it off entirely and replace it with an open competition to select the crown princess. Media stood there in genuine shock. Back in the present, at the birthday celebration, Psyche decided that from now on, she would stay close to Helio to avoid any further complications. But then Helio's attention was suddenly pulled toward Eros, standing alone on the other side of the room, and a realization began to crystallize that Media had fallen directly into Eros's carefully constructed trap, and that whatever she had discovered was the reason the prince had moved against her. Without wasting a single moment, Helio set off to find Media, and Psyche followed quickly behind him. And as he ran, Helio was turning over the promise he had made 7 years ago to become powerful enough to protect Media, no matter what happened. But the palace held 12 expansive gardens, and finding the right one felt impossible. At his most desperate moment, Psyche rushed up to him and told him she knew exactly which garden Media had gone to. Back in the garden, Media had already taken down one more opponent, and now only one remained. And she already knew that the girl across from her had been studying her weaknesses, looking for the moment to exploit them. And the longer this dragged out, the worse her position became. Despite the injuries mounting across her body, Media held on, and the girl came forward with her sword sweeping dangerously close. And then the blow struck, and Media felt the depth of the wound that caught her eye, and the possibility settled over her that she may have lost sight in it. The woman sneered and declared the fight over, and that victory belonged to her now. And she lunged forward, again and again, swinging her weapon with full intent. Media watched the movement closely, and something in the pattern felt wrong, and she locked onto the weak point and made up her mind that even if it cost her dearly, she was going to end this right now. Her back came up against a tree, and there was no direction left to retreat. And just as the blade angled toward her throat, Media swept her foot behind the woman's ankle and took her legs out from under her. She took full advantage of the stumble and thrust forward, and when the woman went down, Media delivered the final blow. And when it landed, the woman lay still, but managed to say, "It's different from what he said." And of course it was different, because the one she had been hunting was Psyche, and the one standing here was Media. This woman had been loyal to her master even in the last seconds of her life, and would not reveal the name. But before leaving the world, she left Media one parting gift and pressed a poison dagger into her hand. And then she was gone. And Media, too, collapsed to the ground. Helio arrived to find her lying motionless, and he called her name with a voice that shook. He had never once seen Media sleep before, and he still remembered the time he had jokingly asked if he could watch her sleep. And now, seeing her, utterly still, filled him with a terror he had no name for. In the most desperate corner of his mind, he began to consider something unthinkable. But that was the exact moment Psyche rushed in and seized the poison dagger before anyone could reach for it. When Helios spun around and saw that Medea was somehow still breathing, he could not believe what he was looking at. And a heartbeat later, Medea sat straight up and grabbed Psyche by the collar and said, "This was supposed to be your burial!" Medea demanded to know whether she had been put into this world purely as a sacrifice in place of Psyche, and every word she flung at Psyche was drenched in fury, and she said that living a single day inside Psyche's body had already been more than enough for her. Psyche could only keep apologizing, and Medea wasn't even sure what the apology was for, whether it was for leaving or for the body swap itself. And while Psyche had undeniably taken everything from her, the real culprit was someone else entirely, and it was the person who had put a certain book into Psyche's hands, the person who had hired spies to manipulate the public during the crown princess selection, and the one who had arranged to shift the blame for the attempt on the king's life onto Medea's family. In this moment, Medea truly wanted to tell Psyche exactly who was behind all of this, but the words would not come out of her. Psyche wanted to bring someone to the royal palace who could heal Medea, but when she found Helio, he was weeping so completely, as though he already understood that no one was capable of saving her, and he looked utterly stripped of power. Helio thought in that moment that perhaps this was retribution for all the lives he had taken over the years, and the gods had chosen to punish him by taking away the person he loved most in this world. Seeing Medea's condition, Psyche could not hold back her own tears, and she thought that if the gods had arranged this soul swap so that Medea could live, then even one day of it would be worthwhile. In a place entirely removed from everything else, Medea opened her eyes and found herself in the water, but she could still breathe and still speak, and the place felt faintly familiar, as if she had been here before. She had fallen once again into the arms of the divine, and it was the sacred pond inside the temple. And when she wondered aloud whether she was still alive, mocking laughter drifted down from somewhere above her. When it became clear the deity had no intention of answering her, she turned and started searching for answers herself, and she followed a massive wall until she came to a crack in it. And when she pressed her eye to the opening, she was astonished to see a young version of Psyche sitting with her mother, looking through a book together that showed a fiery dragon and an endless sky. Young Psyche asked her mother if she could step out into the world the way the figure in the book did, and her mother's face darkened, and she said it was far too dangerous out there, and that Psyche was a blessed child of the deity, and if she ventured outside, jealous people would move to hurt her. Her mother then told her a story about a princess who was cursed to eternal slumber for doubting the deity, and when she finished, she warned Psyche to remember, above all things, that she must never doubt. But a few years later, the one who finally opened the door and led Psyche out of that basement was not the deity at all, but someone else entirely, and they brought her outside to show her the vast sky and the endless land for the very first time. And when that person came back, Psyche couldn't hold back her tears, because Eros had been her true deity all along, and he had come because he had heard she was living with Medea. And he advised Psyche to stay away from Medea, but Psyche told him that Medea was her first real friend. Medea pulled herself away from the wall, feeling no desire to watch the rest unfold, because she already knew how the story ended. And she understood now what the wall in front of her truly was. It was the wall she had built around herself with her own hands from the time she was a child to keep the outside world away. Then she heard the sound of Psyche's inner voice, turning over a desperate thought, saying that if only she were as strong as Medea, she would not have to be afraid of anything. During the prayer ceremony, Medea heard the deity's voice, and the deity said plainly that because Medea had wished to take everything from Psyche by becoming her, she also had to carry Psyche's unhappiness as part of the bargain. Medea sat with this for a moment, and then asked why both of them were required to bear the consequences of another person's sin entirely. And she refused to accept it, and she refused to stay here and watch while the one truly responsible walked away untouched. At that moment, a ray of light broke through, and a drop of Psyche's blood fell onto the necklace Medea was wearing. And in the final seconds before it happened, the knight had reached out to seize that necklace. And then the miracle came, and Medea woke up. Helio and Psyche sat frozen on either side of her, like statues, and then, after 2 still seconds, they both burst into tears at exactly the same time. And Medea extended her arms and said, "Come here," and they both rushed into her embrace. After stroking Helio's head and steadying him, Medea hesitated over Psyche for a long moment, unsure what she should do. And then, after several silent seconds, she placed her hand on Psyche's head as well. A short while later, Psyche revealed to both of them that she possessed divine power, and that the power allowed her to heal but could not reverse life-threatening injuries. And Helio mentioned that the necklace around Psyche's neck had started glowing when she held Media close. The necklace might be a sacred artifact, Media thought, and she remembered suddenly how the soldier had reacted strangely to it, and she recalled what Eros had disclosed to them before sending the 5 knights out, and he had told them that Psyche was born with a divine strength, and the only way to eliminate her was to exhaust that healing power by inflicting wound after wound, and when the healing was finally depleted, that would be the moment. And he had also revealed that when those on her side released their power, the necklace absorbed and channeled that energy, and that besides Psyche, only members of the royal family could access divine power of that magnitude. When Psyche understood that the necklace Media had been wearing was Eros's personal gift to her, the blood drained from her face. Media watched Psyche struggle with it and felt something close to sympathy, because Psyche's love for Eros had always been genuine and real. Media leaned in and told Psyche something, and when she finished, Psyche looked absolutely terrified. Then Media turned to Helio and asked for a sword, and when he handed it to her, she drew it across her own palm, and the healing closed the cut before anyone had time to react. And because Psyche had carried this ability, she had been kept locked away in secret her entire life. The most pressing problem now was that if Media walked back into the banquet without a mark on her, she would immediately raise suspicion, and Helio stood watching as Media deliberately reopened and added to her injuries, wondering how on earth this woman could recover her fighting spirit this quickly. Media had already given Helio a secret task and told him to complete it and return to the banquet after. And when the doors swung open, the banquet guests could not have been more unprepared for what walked in, because Media reappeared looking like she had walked through a battlefield. Eros sent 5 hand-selected knights to eliminate her, and she already knew that he had never intended for Psyche to survive either, and that was why she had told Psyche privately that she no longer wished for Eros to exist in this world. When Eros's eyes found her face across the room, he was genuinely shaken, and the glass of red wine in his hand slipped and shattered on the floor because he could not understand how Media was still standing. Media called out to him, and with so many witnesses watching, Eros had no choice but to play the role of a worried fiancé. And before he could open his mouth, Media raised her voice and accused him of abandoning her, asking why he was still here when he had promised to meet her in the garden and never appeared while unknown attackers came at her from the shadows. Eros grabbed her arm and pressed through his teeth, asking who had summoned her there and what the attackers looked like, and then he declared to everyone listening that clearly someone had impersonated him to use her as a target, and he demanded that she describe every detail of the 5 people she had encountered. Media played along perfectly and gave detailed and precise descriptions of each one, and then turned the conversation by asking why those people knew about their private meeting place at all. And the crowd around them erupted in animated discussion. Eros ordered every door in the banquet hall sealed and announced that whoever had been surveilling him was almost certainly a high-ranking noble with treasonous intent, and if they were identified, they would be executed for high treason. And when someone in the crowd dared to push back, Eros looked at them and said calmly that anyone who objected would become the first suspect. Then he took Media by the arm, and they left the hall together. Once they were alone in a horse-drawn carriage, Eros offered her apologies that were as hollow as empty pottery, and told her to wait while he went to search for her. Eros continued to perform his role, and held her hands, and told her how deeply he blamed himself for failing to protect her, and then asked who had come to her aid at the critical moment, and mentioned placing a reward on her savior's behalf. And Media quietly laughed to herself, thinking that if Eros truly loved Psyche, the most compassionate thing he could do was help her bury every memory of what had happened in that garden. She invented a fictional description of her rescuer and gave it to him to chase, and before he left, he asked if there was anything at all that she needed, and said he was prepared to give her anything. Meanwhile, Helio was walking Psyche through the precise and deliberate way Media spoke without making a sound, and the maidservants nearby found the sight of the 2 of them together endlessly entertaining, and had apparently been discussing it among themselves with some enthusiasm. Psyche had originally assumed Helio's darkened expression was a reaction to those rumors, but the truth was that he had been plagued by nightmares recently, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw the devastating images of what Media had gone through in that garden. Eros had still made no headway in tracking down who was responsible, because his investigators had come back empty-handed. And after deliberating, he decided to lay a carefully placed trap. While Psyche was in the middle of a sword practice session, an invitation arrived from the royal palace. The same invitation had been sent to Helio, and when Psyche's father learned that Medea wanted to study swordsmanship, he was horrified. But the moment he noticed that her hair had been cut noticeably shorter, he looked at her as though the ground had shifted beneath him. And on that note, we leave you here, right at the edge of what comes next, because the trap has been set, and neither side is ready to lose, and every secret still buried beneath this palace is about to come spilling into the light.